Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of the first lecture in this introduction to phonology. So as I said at the end of the previous video, we can come to talking about, well, what now is the real content of this course? If you don't already have a clear idea of what phonology is, let's try to clear this up before we go into introducing any methods concerning the analysis of phonological systems. So phonology, as the etymology of the word suggests, is involved with studying the sounds of language. And within linguistics, as a science altogether, there are two major subfields that concern themselves with the study of sounds. And as you can see, the words phonetics and phonology both begin with the same orthographic sequence and same sound sequence, deriving from the ancient Greek form pune, meaning sound. So essentially, these are both areas of science that concern themselves with the study of sounds. Now, many of you probably have had some general introduction to phonetics, at least already, and already in this lecture, I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about distinctions between place and manner of articulation. But given that we have these two subfields of linguistics that concern themselves with the study of sounds, we can ask ourselves, well, how is the difference between phonetics and phonology to be properly characterized? Well, phonetics, on the one side, we can see this as the study of sounds that is concerned with what is actually happening out in the world with sound events that we can concretely detect and perceive. So this involves articulation, namely how sounds are produced using the vocal tract, acoustics, what sounds are like in the world, what kind of properties, say in terms of measurable sound waves, do those sounds have, and perception, namely how do speakers perceive those sounds, what do they believe that they are hearing. And incidentally, this will be a major theme during this course. We'll see that the first of these aspects of phonetics, articulation, is probably the most relevant for phonology. So in terms of doing phonology, I would say it's probably not necessary for you to know very much about acoustics or the perception of sounds. There may be a little bit on the perception side that is relevant, but largely if you have a general idea of how the production of sounds, the articulation of sounds in the vocal tract occurs, that will constitute a reasonable basis for carrying out phonology. So in contrast to phonetics, we can say that phonology then studies rule systems, the rule systems that languages employ in order to generate sounds in contact with one another, so to say. And we can say that a phonology, a phonological grammar, will consist of a fixed number of discrete categories. We'll see in a little bit that those discrete categories we'll end up referring to as phonemes. And in the approach we're going to adopt in this course, we'll assume that the phonological grammar also has rules that operate on those categories. So rules that can alter those sounds in some way. Good. So if phonology is concerned with sort of abstract rule systems, then that means that it's not something immediately accessible to us in the way that, say, we can make a recording of me speaking and then analyze the sound waves of that, or we can look take an x-ray of someone while they are speaking and see how their tongue is moving. So this means that the study of phonology is necessarily very different from the study of phonetics, where we have that external data. These phonological rule systems can't be directly observed. Instead, we have methods that allow us to make inferences through our observations, analyses, and theory building that helps us to try to describe a phonological system. So in a real sense, phonology is dependent upon phonetics. That is, we need at least that very solid basis of articulatory phonetics in order to do phonology in a sensible way. But all of the really fine-grained phonetic detail is not necessarily part of the phonological grammar. So the very precise aspects in which a sound may be produced is not necessarily so relevant to phonology. And our ultimate aim in trying to analyze the phonological system or part of the phonological system of any given language is to try to recover the systems of tacit or unspoken, or we could say yeah, not inherent, but rules that speakers intuitively know in order to have some effect on the sounds in their languages. So this fact that the rules are tacit, not consciously known by the speakers, gives us an idea of why linguistics in general is often closely allied with the fields of psychology and cognitive science, because we're interested in something that is unconscious. For the most part, speakers, when they are using their native languages, they are not applying conscious rule systems, but they're using intuitive knowledge that has somehow been built up and accumulated. And we have to try to use methods of observation and inference to access that subconscious or tacit knowledge that people clearly have. So let's think now in a little more detail about what phonologists, people who like themselves consider, people who like me consider themselves to be phonologists, try to actually investigate, and how concretely we try to construct a phonological grammar. So in the first place, we're simply going to try to systematically observe data, and we're going to want to have relatively good, in a sense, phonetic data from a native speaker linguist or through careful fieldwork. So when I say a native speaker linguist, we could say, oh, have a native speaker of English or German or Italian, whatever language, who has some training in methods of phonetics and phonology, and they can see, yes, these are how these words or entire sentences sound, and I can convert that to, I can understand how that should be phonetically represented, and I can compare that with each other. Or when you're doing field work, if there are no persons who are native speakers of a language who have systematic linguistic training, then we would want to work, the linguist would want to work carefully with a native speaker to gather data, making detailed notes on the pronunciation of word forms, and gradually working out, say, the morphological structure of the language, the syntactic structure of the language, seeing how the word forms perhaps, or the sounds look different under different conditions. And so some of the methods of phonemic analysis that we'll be talking about in a few minutes are something that a field worker would begin to do after they've gathered a certain amount of data. And on the basis of the intuitions of native speaker linguists, or the analyses that native speaker linguists can carry out on their own data, or the analyses that field workers are able to carry out, it's possible to develop theories about how phonological systems function generally, and then see if there is data from one or more languages that possibly refutes aspects of a theory. So in general, in terms of theory building, it's easier to disprove a theory than to prove that it is correct. So linguists are very often operating, looking for counter examples to a given theory. And so on the theory internal side, once we have a theory about how phonology in general operates, then we can use those ideas and assumptions to try to develop language-specific systems of rules and see what predictions those rules make. So that's essentially me seeing, okay, now that we have this theory about how phonology works, how can we put this theory in practice in order to explain how the phonological grammar of the given language in which we're interested is going to work. And on the theory external side, just try to, in essence, think hard about the data that we have to determine whether the data provide support for a theory or undermine it. And so, as I said, it's very often when linguists are interested in trying to establish whether a theory works or not, it makes more sense to try to just say, well, this data is incompatible with this theory, and therefore this theory is wrong. And that, I think, provides a little bit of insight into the way in which linguists tend to generally think. Now, in this class, as I mentioned in the first video to some extent, we're going to learn to conduct phonological analysis largely based on the approach that was developed in the 1968 book of Morris Halley and Noam Chomsky, The Sound Pattern of English. Halley alone had written a sort of precursor to this book, The Sound Pattern of Russian, but the kind of general idea of working out rule systems that use a phonological feature system in order to establish which sounds undergo certain processes and in what context do those processes apply, I'd say is first systematically worked out in that book. And so this rule-based approach, we'll be seeing in a little bit what phonological rules look like, then can be said to be more or less codified in the later textbook. It's kind of an advanced textbook, but it's still worth reading for the ideas, by Michael Kenstwitz and Charles Kisseberth from 1979. As I also mentioned briefly in the first video, the general theoretical approach to phonology has changed a lot from between the 1970s and the early 1990s, because from the 1990s, a system of constraint-based phonological analysis, generally known as optimality theory, was developed, and that, I would say, for most practicing phonologists, essentially replaced the rule-based approach that was in vogue between the 1970s and the 1990s. A good introductory textbook for optimality theory is that of René Cacher. Yeah, so you might ask yourself the question of why then, if optimality theory has essentially replaced rule-based approaches to phonological analysis, why has Bruce Hayes written a very helpful textbook that uses rule-based analyses, and why am I deciding to use it in this course? Well, it's essentially because I think that for an introduction to phonological analysis, for a general approach to basic phonological thinking, that rule-based approach is a little more accessible. There's a bit less theoretical baggage, a bit less in terms of overall theoretical problems that people have to wrap their heads around in order to start actually conducting phonological analysis. Rule systems, I think, are fairly intuitive for a lot of people. As it turned out in the scientific literature, trying to do phonology with rule systems does run into really serious problems, which is why practicing phonologists ultimately gave up on it. But for an introduction to how to think about sound systems, how to think about phonological grammars, I find these rule-based analyses to be really helpful. And it is the case that still in a lot of basic descriptive grammars of languages, you will find phonologies described in terms of rules. And still today, practicing phonologists will sometimes first draft ideas in terms of simple rules that then have to be converted into an optimality theory constraint-based analysis. So throughout this course, we're going to encounter lots of different kinds of phenomena and processes. So once we get through, already when we start talking about phonemic analysis, we'll be seeing rules of the first two types, namely processes that change sounds in some way. So rules that delete sounds, remove sounds, rules that insert other sounds, put in other sounds, or which replace one sound with another sound, or which say change some of the properties of a sound. And there are also rules which determine, what kinds of sequences of sounds are allowed. So as a good example, in English, for instance, you won't find any words that begin with the sound sequence bana. So a word, we could imagine an English word, benick. So let's transcribe that phonetically here. Seeing I'll be doing a lot of little phonetic transcriptions, typing quickly like this. Also in my line of work as a phonologist, you learn to input strange symbols with your computer fairly swiftly. Okay, so we have this word, which would be benick, but this is not a well-formed word of English. English won't tolerate having the sequence of a voiceless labial stop followed by a coronal nasal at the beginning of a word. So in some sense, we might imagine, well, maybe there's some rule that eliminates any possible words like that from existing in English. We'll also spend a good amount of time talking about the ways in which rules interact with one another. So sometimes we'll see we have rules that could both potentially operate on the same segment. And in those cases, it's important to think about, what rule applies first, what rule applies second, what actually gets produced. This sounds all a bit abstract right now, I can imagine, but as we see some concrete examples beginning later in this lecture, I hope that it will become a little clearer. After these first three sets of things that we'll study, I would say constitute sort of the main core of this course. If you can learn a lot about how to do this, you have a good foundation of phonological thinking. In the second half of the course, we'll begin to think a bit more about how phonology interacts with other parts of the grammar. In fact, we will tend to talk about phonology mainly at the level of words, and there are already interactions with morphology. The construction of word structure are just totally unavoidable. Interactions between phonology and syntax, we will go into a bit later in the course, and we'll sometimes see how the phonology of a person's first language could have effects on the phonology of a second language. So if I'm a native speaker of English and I'm trying to speak Russian, for instance, how does that impact my Russian phonology, the secondary phonology that I've acquired? Or if, say, I'm a native speaker of Japanese and I'm taking in a lot of loan words from English, how is my Japanese phonology determining that these words that have a source in English are going to be pronounced? And sort of the last major themes that we'll cover in this course get away from the level of individual sounds, segments, let's say. So you can see let's go back to this pseudo word benick for 1 second here that you see on my screen. So each of these individual symbols in the International Phonetic Alphabet represents a single segment, but you'll see also in the phonetic transcription, I've put in this other little symbol here, and that is meant to represent a primary stress. And something like stress is what we can call a supra-segmental aspect of the phonology, something that goes above the level of these sequences of consonants and vowels, let's say. And in case we have longer sequences of consonants and vowels, let's make a word benickly. There we might, as a native speaker of English, there could have let's make this maybe a well-formed word, say nickly could be a possible word of English, let's say. Now I would have the intuition that that group of sounds could be broken up into two parts, and people would tend to call those two parts two syllables. So we'll be looking at how languages perhaps have different rules of syllabification, how they divide up sequences of consonants and vowels into groups somewhat differently. And you'll see here, yes, in this fake English word that I've invented, I've assigned a primary stress, and the primary stress at in the first syllable of the word. Sounds good, sounds more or less correct to me, but we'll be thinking about what kinds of rules do determine where stress or other kinds of prominence in terms of, say, higher pitch or greater intensity is assigned. And that pitch aspect is one of the last topics that we'll cover at the very end of this course. Okay, so hopefully that provides you with something of an idea of what topics we're going to cover in this course and what phonology is interested in trying to do. And we can now begin to move to our first major topic, namely the analysis of sounds in a given language into phonemes.